I read the message twice, then I sat down on the front steps of my own house and didn't go inside. It was my plumber who texted me. Len. He's been fixing things in this house for 16 years. He once replaced the hot water heater the week after my husband's funeral because I couldn't figure out how to do it myself, and I couldn't stop crying long enough to call anyone else. He's that kind of man. Quiet, reliable. The kind of person who shows up and doesn't make a fuss about it. His message said 4 words. Don't come in yet. I was standing in the driveway with my car keys still in my hand. I'd just come back from dropping my son at the airport. He and his wife had stayed for a week after Christmas, and I'd hugged him goodbye at the departure's door and driven home on the 401 in that particular silence that comes after family leaves. The kind of silence that's half relief and half ache. I almost typed back, "What do you mean?" But something stopped me, some instinct I couldn't name. I just stood there in the cold. It was the second week of January, and the temperature had dropped to -14 overnight, and I waited. His second message came 30 seconds later. I think you should call your son before you come inside. I'm sorry. I need to go back a few months to explain what Len was doing in my house that morning. My daughter-in-law had moved in with us in September. Her name is Bryn. She married my son 6 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. I liked her then. She was sharp and funny, and she made my son laugh in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. I thought she was good for him. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a school librarian in Mississauga before I retired. I know how to read people. I thought I knew how to read her. When she lost her job in the fall, she'd been a project manager at a consulting firm downtown. She and my son agreed that she would move in with me temporarily while he finished a work contract in Vancouver. It made sense on paper. I have a 4-bedroom house in Burlington that I've been rattling around in alone since my husband died 4 years ago. Bryn was between jobs. My son didn't want her in their Toronto condo alone for months. And I'll be honest, I was lonely. So she moved in. For the first few weeks, it was fine. She cooked dinner sometimes. We watched things on Netflix. She drove me to a dental appointment when my car was in the shop. I thought, maybe this is what it feels like to have a daughter. I'd only ever had one child, but small things started to bother me. I couldn't pin down what it was at first. Just a feeling, the way she would go quiet when I walked into a room, the way she always seemed to be on her phone when I came downstairs in the morning. Once I walked past the dining room and heard her speaking in a low voice. Not a whisper, but low enough that I couldn't make out words. And when she saw me, she laughed and said she was leaving a voicemail for her recruiter. I told myself I was being paranoid. She was stressed. Job hunting is humiliating. I remember it myself from years ago. You feel like you're auditioning for your own life. Then in November, I noticed the smell. It was faint, something sweet and chemical underneath the smell of dinner. I thought at first it was a cleaning product she'd started using. I have a sensitive nose, always have, and I mentioned it to her once, and she said she'd switched dish soap brands. I let it go, but I started feeling off in December, tired in a way I couldn't explain. Headaches in the morning. I blamed the weather, the shorter days, the grief that always gets heavier around the holidays. My doctor ran a basic blood panel and said everything looked normal, that seasonal fatigue was very common in older women, and that I should try to get outside more. I got outside more. I still felt off. I mentioned it to Len in passing one morning when he came by to fix a slow drain in the upstairs bathroom. He's not a man who pushes, but he listened carefully, and then he said, in that matter-of-fact way he has, "You know what causes smells like that in older houses? Sometimes it's the pipes, but sometimes it's not the pipes." I didn't think much of it at the time. My son came home for Christmas on December 23rd. He looked tired from the contract, thinner than I liked. Bryn was attentive with him in a way she hadn't been with me, warmer, more present. I watched the two of them together and told myself again that I was being unfair. This was her husband. Of course she was different with him. But on December 27th, something happened that I haven't told my son the full story of yet. I came downstairs at 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. I do that sometimes. I make tea and sit in the kitchen with the lamp on and read until I feel tired again. The house was quiet. I assumed both of them were asleep. The basement light was on. I have a finished basement. My husband's old woodworking tools are down there, and I'd converted one corner into a small office space after he died. Nobody uses it much. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened, and I heard Bryn's voice, very low, saying something I couldn't make out. And then she said, clearly enough that I heard every word, "It just needs to be a little longer." I stood there for a long moment. Then I went back to the kitchen and made my tea and sat there until the basement light went off, and I heard her come upstairs and go back to bed. I didn't sleep at all that night. I didn't say anything to my son. I didn't know what I would say. I heard your wife in the basement at 2 in the morning. I don't know what she was doing. Something doesn't feel right. That's not a sentence you say to your child about his wife without consequences. I kept waiting for something more concrete, something I could point to. When my son left on January 8th, I drove him to Pearson and hugged him for a long time at the departure's door, and I almost said something then. Almost. But he looked so tired, and his flight was early, and I told myself to wait. I was still telling myself to wait when I pulled back into my driveway and found Len's message on my phone. I called my son from the driveway. It was 7:40 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't boarded yet, which was the only piece of luck in all of it. I said, "Len is at the house and he says I shouldn't go inside and I think something is wrong." There was a silence. Then my son said, "Mom, I need to tell you something." He'd asked Len to come by. He hadn't told me because he hadn't wanted to upset me before he had anything concrete. But over Christmas he'd noticed things, the smell I'd mentioned, the fatigue I'd been attributing to the season, a conversation he'd overheard in fragments between Bryn and someone on the phone. After he left that morning, he'd called Len from the departures lounge and asked him to go to the house before I got back. Len had gone in with the key my son had texted to the lockbox code for. He found things in the basement. I'm not going to describe all of it here because some of it is still part of an ongoing legal process and my lawyer has asked me to be careful. What I will say is this. There was a container of something that had no business being in my house. There was a notebook with what turned out to be a record of dates and amounts. And there was a burner phone. A cheap prepaid one with text messages on it that when my son showed them to me later made my hands shake so badly I had to set the phone down on the table and walk away. The messages were to a man I later found out was a friend of Bryn's from before she married my son. They talked about the house. They talked about the will. They talked in terms I still can't think about without my chest tightening, about timelines. She had been trying to get me to change my will. For 4 months, she had been gently, persistently raising the subject of estate planning. She'd framed it as concern. She'd mentioned a neighbor whose family had been in a dispute after the mother died without an updated document. She'd suggested, more than once, that I should add her name directly, not just my son's, to protect him in case something happened to him before something happened to me. She'd said it was what people did these days. She'd made it sound sensible. I hadn't done it yet. I kept putting it off. I think some part of me knew something was wrong, even when my conscious mind was busy making excuses. What Len found that morning suggested that the timeline on her patience was running out. My son didn't get on his flight. He stayed. He called his sister-in-law, his sister, not Bryn's, who was a lawyer in Ottawa, and she was at my house by 4 in the afternoon. She sat at my kitchen table with her laptop and her yellow legal pad, and she listened to everything. And she said, "You need to call the police. Tonight, not tomorrow." We called the police that evening. I won't pretend the next several weeks were simple. They weren't. Bryn was out of the house that night. She'd gone to see a friend in Toronto, which turned out to be fortunate. And when she came back the following morning, there were 2 officers in my driveway. I stood in my front hallway, and I heard her outside, and I heard the moment she understood what was happening, and the sound she made is not something I want to describe. What came out in the weeks after was more than I'd known. The consulting firm hadn't let her go. She had been asked to resign after a financial irregularity was flagged in an internal audit she hadn't told my son. She had been in debt to someone, the friend from the messages, a significant amount, and she had been terrified of what would happen when my son found out. What she had decided instead of telling him was to solve the problem a different way. I don't know at what point a person decides to do something like that. I've thought about it a lot in the months since. I was a librarian for 31 years. I spent my career putting books in the hands of young people, and I genuinely believed, that people were mostly doing the best they could. I still believe that most days. But I also know now that the woman who cooked dinner in my kitchen and drove me to my dental appointment and sat beside me on the couch watching television was measuring something, calculating something. And I was the number she was trying to solve for. My doctor ran a more thorough panel after everything came out. The results took 3 weeks. I sat with my son in the doctor's office and we held hands like I haven't done with him since he was maybe 7 years old. And my doctor said there was evidence of low-level exposure to something over a sustained period. Not enough to have caused permanent damage, but enough that my fatigue and headaches in December made a specific kind of sense now. I cried in the car afterward, not because of the result. The result was the best it could have been, given everything. I cried because I thought of all the mornings I'd blamed myself, all the times I'd thought, I'm just getting older. This is what getting older feels like. I'd been kind to her in the face of something I couldn't name. I'd made excuses for her. I'd talked myself out of my own instincts for months. I don't do that anymore. The thing I keep coming back to is Len. He's not someone I would have described before all of this as a person who plays a role in dramatic situations. He's a plumber from Oakville who has worked on my house since 2008. He knows where the shutoff valve is. He knows the house makes a particular sound in cold weather when the pipes contract. He once found a dead raccoon in the crawl space and removed it without being asked, and didn't charge me for the extra hour. My son had asked him to go to the house that morning because he trusted him and because there was no one else who could get there in time. And Len went. At 7 in the morning in -14 weather, he drove across town and let himself in and found what he found, and sent me 4 words that kept me standing in my driveway instead of walking through my own front door. When I thanked him properly, a few weeks later, I had him over for dinner, him and his wife, which is a thing I should have done years ago. He looked embarrassed and said he was just glad he could help. His wife squeezed his arm. I saw that. I thought about my husband and about all the quiet things a person does in a life that no one sees. I told Len that he probably saved my life. He shook his head and said I was exaggerating. I didn't argue with him, but I wasn't exaggerating. Bryn's case went through the courts for most of the following year. Her friend, the man from the messages, was also charged. My son's sister flew down from Ottawa for the hearings and sat beside him every time, and I sat on his other side, and we did not speak much on those days, but we didn't need to. My son and Bryn are no longer married. I don't talk about that part much, because it isn't my story to tell. What I know is that my son is not the same person he was before January of that year, and neither am I. And I think we have both had to make a kind of peace with the fact that you cannot always know a person, even a person you've chosen, even a person who has sat at your table, What you can sometimes know is a plumber who has fixed your pipes for 16 years. What you can sometimes know is your son calling from an airport departures lounge because something didn't sit right with him and he decided to trust that feeling instead of talk himself out of it. I think about that a lot, about the moments when we choose to trust the thing that doesn't sit right, about what it costs to do that and what it costs not to. My house is quiet now. It's been almost a year. The fatigue is gone. The headaches are gone. I go to bed when I want to, and I make tea in the middle of the night sometimes, and I sit in the kitchen with the lamp on, and the house makes its cold weather sounds, and I am not afraid of it. I asked Len last spring if I could put a good word in for his business online. He laughed and said I didn't have to do that. I did it anyway. It was the least I could do. I keep thinking about the night I stood in my kitchen at 2 a.m. and heard Bryn's voice coming up from the basement. I knew something was wrong. I felt it the way you feel a change in weather before the clouds come. Something in the air, something that makes you go still. And I talked myself out of it. I made my tea and I went back to bed and I told myself I was paranoid, that I was projecting, that this is what happens when you live alone too long and read too many mystery novels. That habit, the habit of silencing your own instincts, is something I've been thinking about ever since. There's a kind of integrity that has nothing to do with grand gestures. It's quieter than that. It's the thing that makes Len drive across town at 7 a.m. in January because someone he trusts asked him to. It's the thing that made my son pick up the phone from an airport departures lounge instead of telling himself it could wait. It's not heroism. It's just people choosing to do the right thing when it would have been easy, genuinely easy, to do nothing. Len could have said it wasn't his business. My son could have boarded his flight. Neither of them did. I used to think of honesty as something you practiced with other people. Now I think the harder practice is being honest with yourself. Bryn was intelligent. She was organized. She was strategic. She thought several steps ahead. But she used all of that in the service of something that required her to lie. To my son, to me, to herself, about what she was willing to do. Intelligence without integrity doesn't protect you. It just makes the damage more precise. What saved me wasn't luck exactly. It was the accumulation of small decisions made by people who didn't look away when something felt wrong. My son noticed things over Christmas and chose to act on them instead of explaining them away. Len went into that basement and faced whatever he found there with the same steadiness he brings to everything. My son's sister flew in from Ottawa and sat with us through months of hearings without being asked twice. None of them were dramatic about it. They were just present, and they held on. I think about that when I feel myself starting to minimize something. When I catch myself thinking, it's probably nothing. I'm probably overreacting. I've learned to sit with that feeling a little longer now, to ask what I actually know versus what I'm hoping is true. The hardest part of this whole story, the part I don't talk about much, is that I was kind to her. I genuinely tried. I cooked for her, I gave her privacy, I made room. And I'm not sorry I did those things. Kindness isn't a mistake just because someone took advantage of it. What I'm working on now is understanding that being open-hearted and being clear-eyed are not opposites. You can hold both. You can be generous and still trust what your gut is telling you in the dark. My house is mine again. That took longer to feel true than I expected. But it does feel true now.